2,000 years ago, one superpower, Rome, dominated the world. It became famous for its military and for having rule of law and a stable currency people could rely on. They built beautiful buildings, roads, aqueducts. They created art and literature. Rome flourished for more than 200 years in relative peace and prosperity. But then it crumbled. Why? Well, political leaders grabbed power. That power turned many into tyrants who indulged in debauchery and corruption. They raised taxes to pay for war and increased regulation. When the masses complained, they tried to please them with handouts.
Sound familiar? Is this what's happening to America? Well, 1,000 of us have gathered here to debate that question. And that's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
Tonight, I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada for a special edition of our show. I'd like to say that all these people came here just for that, but they really came for Freedom Fest, the world's biggest gathering of free minds. This year's topic, are we becoming Rome? Now, free minds, that's a phrase we libertarians like to use to describe ourselves. This is basically a big conference of libertarians, and I think our minds are unusually free, right? We had to free our minds to get these concepts, but a lot of people think we're crazy. But on to tonight's topic, Rome. Is the United States about to fall as Rome did? Here's a depiction of barbarians sacking the city. Is this our future? First, we hear from a conservative, a historian, and a libertarian. The conservative, Steve Forbes of Forbes Media. You have some libertarian leanings, but conservative, I would call you. The historian, Carl Richard, is an expert on Rome. The libertarian, Matt Kibbe of FreedomWorks, a group that fights against big government. So, Matt, you first. Are we becoming Rome?
I think we are. I think the parallels are quite ominous. The debt, the expansionist foreign policy, the arrogance of executive power taking over our country. But I do think we have a chance to stop it.
Carl?
I think there are similarities not only with the fall of the empire, which is what most people talk about when they talk about the fall of Rome, but also the fall of the Republic, which was 500 years earlier. And there I see Romans engaging in unconstitutional acts, political leaders, and so on, and I see some of that.
Unconstitutional acts like stuffing ballot boxes, corruption, what
No, that did happen, the sort of under-the-table corruption, and that's bad, obviously, but it doesn't bother me as much as the overt things. For instance, Marius was elected consul 6 years in a row, even though under the Roman Constitution it was term limited to 1 year. And people just kept voting for him. They knew it was unconstitutional. So that kind of stuff.
And now we have Congress passing laws they haven't read.
Right, and we have presidents of both parties legislating by executive order, saying I'm not going to enforce certain laws because I don't like them. We have bureaucrats legislating through regulations. We have Supreme Court saying it's constitutional for the government to take your property and sell it to someone else because he can give us more tax revenue. There are a lot of examples.
Steve?
Well, yes, you can always find parallels, but the fact that we're meeting, I think, shows that the antidote is coming about. We, the people, have not gone the way, been totally corrupted the way the Romans were. We're not passive. We saw it with the Tea Parties, and despite IRS suppression, the Tea Party movement is coming back again. You're going to see it in 2014 and 2016. And they may try to feed us to the lions, but we're going to own the lions because we believe in free enterprise.
That's a happy thought. I wish I were as optimistic as you, but I fear we will become Rome. And let me just poll the audience. Are you as optimistic as Steve? How many of you think we're going down the tubes, we're in deep trouble? most. How many of you think we're going to turn it around? They can't both be true. But again, you are not a normal audience because you're libertarians, right? I mean, wacko birds, according to Senator John McCain. That's what he called some libertarian-minded politicians. But walking around here at this conference and seeing the Tea Party booths and people selling investments in gold and game show quizzes that test your knowledge of dead Austrian economists, you have to kind of understand why we get our reputation as eccentric and wonkish and different. Is this unfair? Is this fair? No. Come on, isn't this group mostly men, mostly badly dressed men? My going to libertarian events, this is what I notice. It's people who care about numbers, less about how they look. I think Steve Forbes is a perfect example of this. He's the epitome of the wonkish geek. Is this unfair?
You're sounding like my opponents, and so I didn't expect that from you. But let's face it, people who make things happen. You could describe our forefathers, our revolutionaries, in the same way. They're always minorities who see something's wrong, go out and persuade, become agitators, and change the world. And we've done it once, and we're going to do it again. We are going to be the leader. Absolutely. And you, of all people, should know, don't look at the superficial. Look at the substance. We've got the substance. That's why we're going to ultimately win.
I admire, this is the optimism that makes America possible. Matt, what about my libertarian slur? I look at your sideburns, and I think people would say, this is not a normal guy.
Definitely guilty as charged.
But you go to 1,000 of these meetings. Are the people different? How?
We're different because we have read books, and we do care about ideas. But social awkwardness is not a sin in the defense of liberty.
And any I'm socially awkward too. I overcome it because I have to, because I have a TV show. But ask my friends or ask Imus and he'll tell you I'm socially awkward. But what is it about many of people who like to analyze? I mean, Bill Clinton is the opposite. He felt your pain and then spent more money. Is it a personality type?
Well, you know, economists would argue that everything we do when we fight for freedom, when we show up at rallies, when we care about the future of our country, economists would say that's irrational. But we happen to think it's the best thing to do because we care not only about our country, but our future and our kids' future. That's not normal in this country, and that's what we have to fix.
But it's part of our culture. Entrepreneurs, they're always outliers, always trying to see things that others aren't seeing. I mean, Steve Jobs famously said, do you do marketing surveys? He said, no, because people don't know what they want until we show them. That's a typical entrepreneur. Put it out there and see if they like it. And so oftentimes we fail, but that's where you try to learn from failure. That's what freedom's about. Take a chance, fail, learn, hope to do it better next time. If we accepted the conventional wisdom, heck, we'd still be living in caves, you know.
Well, we're going to try to show them tonight. Carl, do you have more historical perspective we should think about comparing America to Rome?
You know, the debt, the high spending. I'm talking about the late empire, the high spending.
They had high debt and high spending.
The devaluation of currency, there's another one. You know that by the end of the empire, a so-called silver coin was only 2% silver. That's how they devalued it. And it got to the point that the Roman government would not accept its own currency in taxes. You had to give goods. We're not there yet.
Thank you, Carl. Matt Kibbe, Steve Forbes. Coming up, gladiators devalued currency, a growing welfare state. Other ways, America is just too much like Rome. Welcome back to Freedom Fest. Now, the welfare state. America didn't invent the welfare state. Europe had one, and even Rome had one. I didn't know that till I came to this conference. And two people who've educated me are Charles Murray, author of Losing Ground, the book that woke America up to the destructiveness of welfare, and Larry Reed of FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. So, Larry, I learned from you the welfare state began about halfway through the Roman Empire.
That's right. It took the form first of payments to recipients in the form of subsidized grain. The government gave it away at half price. But the problem was that they couldn't stop there, that later there was a man named Clodius who ran for the office of tribune on a platform of free wheat for the masses, and he won. And it was downhill from there.
And they gradually raised taxes and gave stuff away, a steady stream increasing.
Including free salt, free pork, free olive oil, other staples of the Roman diet. So
people would show up personally and just pick up their stash.
Yeah, well, there'd be long lines. In fact, they had a means test at one time and did away with it so that anybody could show up and get this free stuff.
And they decided that everybody had to be educated by the state. Well, not everybody, but they started public schools.
Well, that was late, much later. In fact, Rome grew to greatness with largely homeschooling. And the first public schools didn't appear until around 250 BC, and they were not funded by the government until very late.
And the Greeks actually mocked Rome for being backwards about that.
That's right, yeah. Well, of course, they didn't last anywhere near as long as the Romans did.
So, Charles, you have educated us about welfare, about these handouts. You see parallels with Rome?
Yeah. I mean, if you take a look at Roman society as it started to decay, it looks a whole lot like we do now. And it's not just because of the welfare state and the people on the bottom, it's also because of the people on the top who are increasingly living isolated lives from the rest of them. I find the parallels between Rome and the United States right now to be very scary.
So clearly the welfare state poisons much of life, has horrible unintended consequences, but do we just get rid of it? Let me ask you libertarians. You're pretty hardcore, I assume. Should America get rid of all handouts? All? But what would happen first time somebody starves? They say charity. Charles Murray, you wrote Losing Ground. What's your answer?
Well, in fact, I think if we got rid of the entire welfare state, that the ability of this very wealthy society to deal with the problems would work, all right? But I also would say, I'm going to go wimpy on you now. Don't applaud. I'm about to go wimpy on you. I don't think it is within the realm of possibility for an industrialized, advanced society with as much wealth as we have to ever do that politically. And I think that libertarians are going to have to strike a grand compromise with the left, in effect saying, all right, we will give you a big spending if you will give us freedom from government interference. And so I'd say, look, I'm with Milton Friedman. I say use a guaranteed basic income for everybody over 21, deposited monthly electronically into a known bank account. That's a very key thing. And let people take their lives back into their own hands. They will have the wherewithal that they can deal with the material necessities of life. If they do not do it, they're going to have to talk to friends, neighbors, churches, the community. They're going to have to make their case. I think that's a better way to go.
You wrote a book about this.
Called In Our Hands, yeah.
All right, I'm going to push back. First, I would say his better book is In Pursuit of Happiness and Good Government, which really brought my mind around. But this book, you're telling me you're going to give him the money, and the crackhead is going to spend it all in 2 months, and then the social worker is going to go on TV and say,
no social worker.
the children There are going to be no, someone, the New York Times reporter will go on and say, you're going to let this woman's children starve? It's not their fault. And then we'll have a whole new program.
Here's what you're going to have, John. You're going to have somebody who smokes it up in the first 2 weeks, all right? He's got another 2 weeks before there's going to be a new deposit in his monthly account, and he says, gee, I don't have any money. All right. He doesn't have the option of going to a social worker. You know who he has to go to? He has to go to the people he lives around and say, all right, I really need help. And they are in a position of saying, okay, we aren't going to let you die, but it's time for you to get your act together. We will introduce, once again, the kinds of human connections that are the only way to change human behavior.
And some who don't find those connections will die on the street, and there'll be screaming.
The United States has never let people die on the street. What we will now have, that we don't have now we have bureaucrats who cannot make the distinction between somebody who needs a kick in the pants and somebody who needs a pat in the back. We will put these kinds of human needs back in the venue of human relationships, whereby you can apply the feedback loops of incentives and approbation and disdain and stigma and all the rest, which can make these problems solvable.
And this audience is different from most in that they understand that before the welfare state, there were these mutual aid societies everywhere, which helped people. Larry, tell us about that.
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing about being a politician that makes you more compassionate or caring than the people who sent you there. And so I have every confidence that...
Compassionate with other people's money.
Yeah, absolutely. So I start from the premise that it's not the business of the government to redistribute our stuff. It's the business of government to protect our liberties.
And in Rome, when they gave out stuff, it often went to the wealthier people?
Oh, well, without a means test, which was the case in most of Roman history, anybody could line up to get these goodies, which contributed to the ultimate bankruptcy of the Roman state.
And one telling graph about the poverty rate is that the advocates of the war on poverty, welfare, can say, look how the poverty line dropped sharply for 5 years after the war on poverty began. But then you look at what happened before the war on poverty began, and the line was just as sharp. People were lifting themselves out of poverty. Government kept things improving and then stopped progress.
The great untold story of the poverty rate is that there was a miracle that happened from the end of World War II to the early 1960s. It was cut from about 40% of adults who were beneath the poverty line, as we now define it, to about 20%. The war on poverty starts, the line continues to go down for a couple of years, and it flattens out where it's been ever since.
Because we taught people to be dependent.
The way I put it is, we changed the rules of the game that made it profitable for low-income people, and especially young low-income people, to do things that looked like, gee, this makes sense in the short term and are disastrous in the long term.
I think the primary beneficiaries of the welfare state are the politicians, not the people that the welfare is intended for.
Why?
Somebody once said that the welfare state is so named because the politicians get well and the rest of us pay the fare. And I think that's exactly what's happened.
Thank you, Larry Reed and Charles Murray. Coming up, did you know that one Roman emperor held orgies and threatened to execute senators' wives who did not attend? The creepiness of Rome when we return. Welcome back to this special edition of the Stossel Show. We're in Las Vegas for Freedom Fest. Now, most people here are libertarians. We want to shrink government. We don't like taxes. But, hey, we need national defense and local police, some pollution control rules, too. There are some things most of us say government must do. How are they going to get the money? Taxes. Got to have some, right? Yes? It's a tough crowd here. And I see why, and our taxes always tend to go up. And that was part of Rome's problem, say, two people who try to spread the word about the damage taxes do. Grover Norquist is head of Americans for Tax Reform. He's somehow persuaded many politicians to pledge to never raise taxes. Economist Steve Moore covers these issues for the Wall Street Journal. So, Grover, Rome had high tax rates?
Well, not always. At first, for about 400 years, they had no real direct internal taxes because they looted their neighbors. That may not...
We're not advocating that, right?
We got to talk to the Canadians, but that may not work out. But then even that wasn't enough. And so they started having dramatically higher taxes. The amount of money they spent on the armies to occupy those other guys cost more perhaps than they were able to extract. Taxes got...
They started with tariffs.
They had tariffs. Caesar Augustus brought us the first death tax. Constantine brought us the first income tax. All the stuff that we're now living with, they were thinking up. The property taxes, so rough that people were actually abandoning their property and just say, leave me alone. And then they had to pass laws to not let you leave your property. So you had to stay there and farm it so they could loot you. Things got, towards the end, it got very, very rough, and it's part of why things didn't work.
One penalty for not paying your taxes was being sold into slavery.
Or killed. Yeah.
That's the modern day IRS, right? I mean, that's what they do to us now.
When they would demand payment in gold and silver, the only way to get it was to sell, in some cases, children into slavery, oneself into slavery, to get currency. It was that bad. Yeah.
But 1%, I read, was the highest income tax. Steve,
well, what happened, I mean, Grover's exactly right. And what happened in Rome, and one of the reasons Rome fell, was they kept collecting more and more money from the tributaries, the outlying areas, and it all went into Rome. And you had a massive revolt among the people all over the country who weren't in Rome. And by the way, that's happening in America today, I think. People are sick and tired of seeing their tax dollars sent to Washington and none of it coming back to the states from whence it came. And that's one of the reasons I think we should lower federal taxes and let states do this. That's one of the great things about America. We're a federalist system. The states created the federal government. The federal government did not create the states.
The reaction
right?
The reaction to the tax farmers that they had that would go out and collect the taxes.
They called them tax farmers?
Tax farmers, tax collectors. It was so bad that in one revolt in Asia Minor, they killed about 80,000 of them in a day or two.
We don't advocate killing tax collectors on this show.
It was a 4-year war that Sulla waged to put down that revolt. But it was clearly a serious tax revolt.
And John, to your point, when you asked me about the 1% tax, I don't know what those tax rates were in Rome, but when we created our federal income tax in the United States back in, I think it was around 1913, 1915, the top income tax rate when the income tax started was just 7%. Within 10 years, the top income tax rate went from 7% to 70%. You know, and it's remained high ever since. That's why I've always believed Steve Forbes had it right. We ought to go back to an 18% flat tax, get rid of all the deductions, all the loopholes, make it as simple as possible, collect the money you need, but don't create all these special interest groups. And by the way, the people who are most opposed to the flat tax, the people who are most opposed to the flat tax are people in Washington, D.C., because you take the power away from Washington.
Look, when we went into revolt 1774, 1775, Americans in the colonies were paying 2%. Our oppressors, the Brits in London, were paying 20%. It's expensive running an empire. We need to go back towards 2%. I like 2% better than 18. That's what...
2% would be good, and to be clear, we're at 40% about if you include state and local.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to get we want to get towards 2%. We functioned fairly well beyond that. And the reason the British were taxing themselves at 20% was that they were running an empire.
Thank you, Grover and Steve. Coming up, when governments can't raise taxes anymore, they find other ways to fleece people, like devaluing the currency. Rome did that. Hey, America's doing it now. But what does that do to a country? Didn't work out so well for Rome. That's next. Welcome back to the Freedom Fest Conference, the world's biggest gathering of people like me, people who care first about liberty. Now, most of this audience hates taxes. Actually, even many politicians don't like them because taxing people makes people mad. So forever, politicians have found sneaky ways to fund their spending. Roman emperors put less and less silver in coins they issued. That caused inflation. A bushel of wheat that cost 8 Roman dollars by the next century cost 120,000 Roman dollars. Ben Powell, an economist at Texas Tech, and Jeffrey Tucker of Laissez-Faire Books study currency debasement. They say, we better be careful, the American dollar is already going down the tubes. What do you mean? I've feared that, and yet inflation's low.
Are you kidding me? I mean, look over time, right? There's grandmothers rolling over in their graves right now. In fact, there's grandmothers rolling over in their audience seats right now, probably. Any young person has heard someone say, I remember when that cost a nickel. Things didn't all of a sudden get more expensive in terms of the labor we have to use for them. What's happened is the currency's lost its value. It takes $23 to buy today what $1 could back in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created.
But you had to go all the way back to 1913. Paul Krugman will tell you, look, inflation is, what, 2% a year historically? That's pretty good.
This isn't a big mystery, though, right? The Federal Reserve has created a lot of money with QE whatever now that we're up to, but the banks are holding most of it back. It's not going into the price level because they're holding it as extra reserves because the Fed started paying them interest on their extra reserves. If that actually gets lent out, then we'll see higher price inflation.
That's a form of robbery, actually, of savers. And everybody
Explain
understands
that to people.
No, I mean, yeah, it's a serious issue. You can't get a return on your money anymore from saving. Really, you can't sustain prosperity without saving and investment. And that's precisely what these policies are discouraging.
Let's go back to the Rome parallel. Free trade ruled, they prospered, then they they did what politicians do.
Well, their empire kept expanding, and they were bringing in more people that they could basically loot and bring money back to Rome. And eventually, around 100 AD, they hit the maximum extent of their empire, and there was no one left to steal from. And then they started resorting to other ways to raise money, which was debasing their currency and continuing to take the silver out of their coins, raising tax rates. And over time, this was the downfall of Rome, was a big government destroyed Rome. It wasn't the barbarians. The barbarians came as the government was collapsing under its own weight.
Nero issued coins that were 95% silver. Right. Then the next emperor, this is one of those coins, this was 85% silver. And all the way down to...
You've got a good one. 85% silver. It ended up becoming 1/5000th of the silver content of the original by about 300 or so AD.
This is what governments do when they can't tax people. They start to debase the currency. And this is essentially what's gone on in this country for the last 100 years. About 100 years ago, with the creation of the Federal Reserve, we basically, nationalized the dollar. Put it under sort of socialist-style control, under a kind of cartel arrangement. And we've seen its quality diminish over the 100 years, which is actually faster than really happened under Rome, if you think about it.
But it's hard to get people worked up about this because they look around and they say, by and large, America is doing pretty well.
There's a great deal of distortion in the system. People thought the real estate markets were doing pretty well in 2007. There are surprises around the corner, and especially with a government that refuses to fund itself honestly. This is dishonest funding. The very fact of the existence of the Fed makes the government too big to fail. The politicians don't even have to worry about spending restraint. So long as the Fed is there with its unlimited credit card to always pay for everything. There's no default risk on U.S. treasuries. We have just this unlimited spending. There will be no spending restraints so long as the Fed is there to bail anyone and everyone out all the time.
When inflation comes, then what will the government do? The Romans issued wage and price controls.
The United States government has already done this. Remember when the dollar was finally divorced from gold in 1971, what came right afterwards? A decade of high inflation in the 1970s and universal wage and price controls under Nixon. Now, Nixon was kind of a softie compared to the Roman emperors, because Diocletian, when he did it in 300 AD, he made it punishable by death. And even still, you got all the same bad consequences: shortages, decreases in quality, products not coming to market, distortions throughout your economy.
And distortions, they wouldn't let you change jobs either to get around the controls. Constantine said anyone who violates requirements that they remain in their current occupation may be bound with chains and reduced to a servile condition. You mentioned Diocletian. When he imposed wage and price controls, he blamed greed. Some people are always eager to turn a profit, even on blessings from the gods. Our shared humanity urges us to set a limit.
I hate it when people use greed to explain something, because greed is constant. It's always there. So that can't explain a price spike or a price decrease when everyone's like, the greedy oil companies are driving up prices. Whoever says, hey, look, the oil companies got less greedy, the price came down. It doesn't work like that. Greed doesn't explain.
One solution, some people say, to government playing with the currency is a gold standard. But we had one for a while. It didn't really work.
A pure gold standard would be a great thing. The problem with the gold standard is that
just before you answer this is for this libertarian audience.
Yeah.
How many of you own gold? Either actual gold or investment? Just about everybody. I imagine you watching out there, it's not so high. So you're different. Why? Because you don't trust those Federal Reserve notes? Take it away.
No, gold, a really great gold standard wouldn't have the government involved at all.
Now, gold has just fallen from 1,600 to 1,300. Yeah. Some of you people lost a lot of money. Maybe this is bad advice.
Well, gold investment and the gold standard are two separate things. You know, it's always a speculation. You know what you're buying into, and just because you favor the gold standard doesn't mean you're necessarily recommending gold as an investment. And I'm not even.
It seems like they would go together. That you would believe in gold as a.
It entirely depends on what people's expectations of the future are, and that should be embodied in the price of gold now. So it depends. Basically, do we think everybody else is too pessimistic or too optimistic, and that tells us whether it's a good investment, not whether it's a good standard for our money.
What about bitcoins?
Listen, I'm a big fan. I think bitcoins is one of the great innovations. It only came about 4 years ago. It was one in a long succession of attempted digital currencies. It's been the most
bitcoins,
successful.
for those of you who don't know, is an internet form of currency that is limited and ought to protect you against devaluing dollars.
That's a good way to summarize it. It's both a currency and a payment system. Very innovative. By comparison to the dollar, you know, Bitcoin makes the dollar look like a dinosaur. Like there's been no improvement in our money in a very long time. Bitcoin is a currency for the digital age. It's more like physical property. The best thing is the government's not involved with it at all. It was created by the market itself. It's a beautiful thing. The most implausible sort of currency. You know, if you had asked anybody 10 years ago, will the market create a new digital currency that allows me to exchange with anybody in the world, in Central America and Africa, all the world's poor, even if you don't have a credit card, you can still exchange money, will that happen? No, that won't happen. But it did happen. And it's brilliant.
Well, on that note, thank you, Jeffrey Tucker and Ben Powell. Coming up, Roman emperors spent big bucks on stadiums like the Colosseum, used for things like fights between gladiators, sometimes fighting animals. There are American parallels to that, too. That's next. Welcome back to Freedom Fest and the question, are we Rome? Meaning on the route to collapse. Now, ancient Rome's rulers, trying to keep the people happy despite debased currency and corruption, offered distractions and bribes. One Roman poet called it bread and circuses. And sometimes it was an actual circus, or chariot races, or gladiators, sometimes fighting to the death. Now, America doesn't allow that yet. But sports economist J.C. Bradbury says government still does fund circuses. Today they take the form of sports stadiums. What do you mean?
Well, it's a very common thing in a community where a politician says, boy, we really need something to pull our community together to keep us happy. And a sports stadium is just what we need because it's going to increase economic development, community's going to rally around it, and we're all going to be richer.
They say they'll pay for themselves. They don't. In Atlanta, the county would receive $200,000 per year in parking revenue, they got 30,000.
Right, and that's for the Gwinnett Brave Stadium in Gwinnett County. And time after time they said, we're going to get parking revenue. Didn't happen. We're going to get naming rights revenue. Didn't happen. Or they got much less than they said.
It'll pay for itself from day one.
Right, absolutely. And these facilities never do. And the thing I think that's so frustrating for me to see this is that it's been studied so much. Politicians themselves know this.
Yeah, I thought you won this fight. Economists like you have explained it. You say, gee, the football team has 8 home games a year. How's that going to be economic stimulus?
Well, let's go back to the bread and circuses comment. I mean, that is not a positive comment about human species. That's saying that they're being placated. Oh, just give them bread and circuses. And the citizens of Rome were giving up some of their freedoms because politicians gave them the things they wanted. And I think citizens today, they like sports. Sports are popular. And so you say, well, why don't I just go ahead and support this stadium? I'm not going to punish a politician for supporting it.
So let's go back to the Rome parallel, because our stadiums do pale compared to what they did. The Gladiators, this was entertainment to keep the people pacified because they were getting ticked off?
Well, I don't even, not even just that they're ticked off, but it's just some form of entertainment to distract us from other things that are going on. If I know that a politician put a football team on the field and I like football, I'm really going to focus on that. I'm not going to focus on the declining schools. I'm not going to focus on the roads falling apart or other things that may be going on. And maybe some of those things politicians really can't help. But it's certainly something that individuals and citizens can focus on and say, this is a positive thing for our community, and that's why they're so popular among politicians.
Some of the things I've learned at this conference, that most gladiators were slaves or prisoners of war. 90% of them survived the fight because it would be expensive to the owner of the slave if they were killed.
Right, I believe if you end up, the slave was killed, that you'd have to pay the owner, so you didn't want them killed. I mean, this was the type of entertainment for the time, and at the time, seeing death on the streets every day wasn't something that was that uncommon, so it's something that people enjoyed and wanted to see, and you know, luckily we have much more pacifistic sports, if you want to use that word, and we don't have death, and in fact, we're trying to make our sports safer, so it's sort of the difference in the way that we view those competitions today than they were once viewed.
The arrogance of the emperors increased. In 169 BC, 63 African lions and leopards, 40 bears, elephants were hunted down in a single 2-day show. Tigers, crocodiles, giraffes, hippopotamus, they would bring them in from all over the world to kill them, and the emperor would sometimes kill them himself.
Well, I mean, today we have sausage races, club seats, luxury boxes. So, but it's definitely the same thing. It gets more and more extravagant. And that's the same type of attitude that they had in the Roman Empire that we have today.
So at least problematic as our politicians are, they are not that bad. Thank you, J.C. Bradbury.
Thank you.
And when I said that bad, we barely touched the surface of how bad the Roman rulers were. That's next. Is America Rome? No, thank goodness, we're not as bad in 100 ways. Our taxes are actually higher than Rome's, but we don't have slaves. And we don't kill people for sport. When we go to war, misguided or not, we don't conquer or plunder. And when we win, we usually leave. That's different. In America, poor people now live better than the emperors did. We have air conditioning, Google, painkillers, flush toilets, longer lives. Thanks to the example set by George Washington, our presidents actually leave office voluntarily. And although our current president wastes money on extravagant travel, like his recent $100 million trip to Africa, Nero was much worse. He never wore the same clothes twice. And when he traveled with 1,000 carriages. The Emperor Elagabalus, or however you pronounce his name, set up a brothel in the palace. Tiberius established an office of imperial pleasures, which gathered beautiful boys and girls from all corners of the world, so, as Tacitus put it, the emperor could defile them. Caligula is said to have made his favorite horse a senator, as depicted here.
Allow me to introduce Insultatus, a new senator of Rome. You will treat him as your peer in every debate.
Even President Obama wouldn't do that. So arrogant as our politicians are, and repugnant as many of them are, they are at least not emperors who, like Caligula, held orgies and executed the senators' wives who didn't show up. But Rome matters because empires do crumble. Rome lasted the longest of all of them. The Ottoman Empire was next. It lasted 600 years. Then the Spanish, almost that long, as did the British. We've lasted less than 300 years. We're doing better than Alexander the Great. His empire only lasted 13 years. But in our 250 years, we've accomplished amazing things, amazing prosperity. We just can't take it for granted because free and prosperous is not the natural state of things. In human history, it's rare. We now are starting to look a lot like Rome, and we ought to worry about that. That's our show. Thank you for coming. See you next week.